Naka-record na to ha, present ko na. May, si May muna, si Hernandez, Malikdem, Regato, Alemania, Maceda, Lim, Pamela, Robles, at Marquez. Kita nyo na?
Opo, ma'am.
Yes po.
Okay, start na po.
Philippine Indigenous Communities of Southeast Asia. Next slide. What are the countries belongs to Southeast Asia? Here are the countries belong to Southeast Asia. The Brunei, Burma, which is known as Myanmar, Cambodia, TIMOR-LESTE, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. In Brunei, there is nearly 2/3 of the population of Brunei classified officially as Malay. This category, however, includes not only ethnic Malays but also a number of the indigenous peoples, namely the Dusun, Belait, Kedayan, Murut, and Bisaya. Chinese make up about 1/10 of the population. Burma or Myanmar. The Burmese government refers to groups considered indigenous as ethnic nationalities. These include the Shan, the Karen, the Rakhine, the Karenni, the Chin, the Kachin, and the Mon. However, there are more ethnic groups that are considered indigenous. For example, the Aka, the Lisu, the Lahu, or the Mru, among others. Cambodia, the largest indigenous communities are the Khoi, Nong, Tieng, Brau, Tampuan, Pir, Jarai, and Raid. The first 5 speak Mon Khmer languages, whereas Jarai and Raid are both languages of the Malayo-Polynesian branch of the Austronesian language family. In Timor-Leste, the indigenous peoples that comprise Timor-Leste's ethnic groups fall into 2 main categories of origin, the Malayo-Polynesian and the Papuan origin. The ethnic groups of Malayo-Polynesian origin are the Tetum, the Mambay, Tukudede, Galoli, Kenmak, and the Baikeno. In Indonesia, there are over 1,300 ethnic groups in Indonesia, of which 200 are of native Indonesian ancestry. The largest ethnic group in Indonesia are the Javanese people, who make up 41% of the total population. Laos or Lao. Lao people comprise 4 main ethno-linguistic families: Lao Tai, 62.4%, Mon Khmer, 23.7%, Hmong Lu Mien, 9.7%, and the China Tibetan, 2.9%, which are officially divided into 50 ethnic groups. The 50 ethnic groups in the country can be further broken down into more than 200 ethnic groups. In Malaysia, a brief overview: in 2015, it was estimated that collectively the indigenous peoples of Malaysia represented about 13.8% of the country's total population of 31.7 million. And there are 95 subgroups of indigenous people in Malaysia. The number of indigenous peoples in the Philippines is unknown, but it is estimated that between 10% and 20% of the country's population and has 134 ethnic groups, in the majority of which are indigenous. Though much of the overall Philippine population is constituted by only 8 to 10 lowland ethnic groups. In Singapore, There is multiracial and multicultural country with ethnic Chinese, 76.2% of the citizen population, Malays 15%, and ethnic Indians 7.4%. Chinese Singaporeans make up the majority of the population. There are also Eurasians in Singapore. The Malays are recognized as the indigenous community. Thailand. It is estimated that between 600,000 and 1.2 million indigenous peoples, approximately 1 to 2% of the total population of Thailand, live in Thailand. Thailand voted in favor of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in 2007. Last is Vietnam. Indigenous peoples in Vietnam account for about 13.4 million people, or 14.6% of the national population, which is 95 million. Vietnam has 54 recognized ethnic groups, 53 of which are minority ethnic groups, and is therefore considered a multi-ethnic country.
Thank you. Next is si Regato.
So, Brunei. Brunei's largest ethnic group is Malay, which is 66%. Second is Chinese with 10%. Brunei is an independent Islamic sultanate on the northern coast of island of Borneo in Southeast Asia. Next po. Burma, also known as Myanmar, is a melting point of different cultures and traditions with 135 different tribes and ethnic groups. Each has its own history, culture, traditions, and preserved ethnic languages. Isa na dito yung Shan. The Shan are the largest of Burma's ethnic minorities, numbering an estimated 6 million. They are spread across the large Shan states and in Tukaya, Karen, and Kachin states in the Central Mandalay Division. Next po. Cambodia. The largest of the ethnic groups in Cambodia are the Khmer, whose comprise approximately 90% of the total population and primarily inhabit the lowland Mekong subregion in the Central Plains. Next po. Timor-Leste. Among the largest ethnic groups are the Tetum, whose language is one of the country's two official languages, the other being Portuguese. They live mainly around in Dili on the neighboring northern coast. There are also small population of Portuguese and Chinese, as well as people of mixed Timorese and Portuguese origin known as Mestizos. Next po. Indonesia. Javanese people native to the island of Java is the largest ethnic group in Indonesia, with more than 95.2 million people, make up of 40% of total population. Next is Sundanese, Batak, Sulawesi, Madurese, and Betawi. Next reporter po, Mr. Regato.
So Laos, individual ethnic groups, the Lao ethnic groups, Lao Thai family is the largest, accounting for 53% of total population of Laos. Next slide po. Malaysia, the largest group of Malaysians consists of three main races, namely the Malays, Chinese, and Indians. Philippines, the Mangyans of Mindoro are well-known clans in the Philippines because they have the biggest populace, comprising 8 different Mangyan groups. They have a peaceful reputation, unlike the headhunting tribes of the north and warrior tribes from the south. Excuse me. The Chinese Singapore make up Singapore's largest ethnic group. The Chinese are the largest ethnic group in the Singapore, making up almost 3/4 of the country's population. Thailand. Thailand is country of 70 ethnic groups, including at least 24 groups of ethno-linguistically Thai peoples, mainly the Thai, Lao, and Yuan. Vietnam. The largest ethnic groups are the Thai, Hmong, Wa, Mer, and Nu. Each of these populations contains about 1 million people. Some ethnic groups, however, are much smaller. The Bru, Roman, and Odu people only have populations of a few hundred each. Ayon pa po ba yan? Excuse me po.
Ako na. Okay.
Thank you.
Who we are, Alemania po ang nagre-report. Who we are, the indigenous people in Southeast Asia. We are using the term indigenous people with a meaning that is different from that given many dictionaries. So, indigenous meanings refers to the notion of a place-based human ethnic culture that has not migrated from its homeland. It is not a settler or colonial population. So, major ethnic groups in Southeast Asia. This is the Auto-Asiatic. Ethnic groups of Southeast Asia comprise many different linguistic stocks. Ito nga yung Auto-Asiatic. Sa Auto-Asiatic is napakaraming klase ng tao nandyan, which is yung Mon, Palawong, Wa, Mer, Banar, Katuwit peoples, Per peoples, Mu people, Nicobarese people, and Senoy. Dalawang klase yan. Meron pang isa yung Vietic, yung mga Vietnamese people, Hmong, To, and Chut. And the next is Austronesian. Sa Austronesian, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I think nasa 20 types of people ang nakatira dito. Isa na dito yung Javanese people. Meron ding dalawang klase ng Javanese people, which is Osing and Tangiris. And sa Sundanese people naman is dalawang klase din, Baduy and Kasepuhan. And Malay people, meron ding dalawang klase, Chiti and Jawi Peranakan. And meron ding Minangkabau, Maduris, Batak, Balinese, Sasak, Sumbawa people, Banjar people, Bajunese people. Bajunese people, merong dalawang klase, Makassar people and Toraja. Meron din Mandaris people, Minahasan people, Asianese people, Bantenis, Dayak people, Iban. Grabe, ang dami yan. Austronesian pa lang po yan. Meron pang Lunbawang, Lundaye, Kadasan, Murut people, Cham people, and Jaray. And dito na tayo kasama. Sa Filipino people, andito yung Bicolano, Gadang people, Ilocano, Ibanag, Igorot peoples. Sa Igorot is, ito yung napag-alalan natin dati. Ito yung Buntok, Ibaloy, Ifugao, Isnig, Kalinga, Kankanae, at saka Tinggian. Sa Tinggian, merong Ilonggot, Itawis, Ibatan, Kapampangan, and Lumads people. Sa Lumads people, ito naman, Bilaan people, Bagobo, Mandaya, Manobo, Mansaka, Matig, Salug, Subanon people, and Tibuli. Sa Mangyan naman, dalawa din, Alangan at saka Tadyawan. Sa Moro people, ito yung mga taga Maguindanao, Maranao, Sama people, Tausug at Yakan. Pangasinan people, Sambal people, Tagalog at Bisayans. Sa Bisayans, merong Aklanon, Butuanon, Cebuano, Hiligaynon people, Surigao-non at Waray. Next is Negrito people. Sa Negrito people, ito yung mga Aita, Andamanis, Ati people, Mamanwa, Mani, Orang Asli. Sa Orang Asli, meron sila ang isang lahi na ang tinatawag is Semang. Next is Sino-Tibetan. Ito yung Bamar people, Karen, Rakhine, Kaimin, Kareni people, Kachin people, Zo people. Sa Zo, merong tatlo, Chin people, Mizo people, and Kuki people. Naga people, ito yung Wa, Han people, North Han people, at Tianxinis, Beijingisi, Shandongsi, Hebisi, and sa southwestern Han Chinese naman, Sichuanese, Yunnanis, Kokang people. So, Fujianese and Fushu people, Kokshia people, Fuchu people. Parang nagmumura na ako eh. Henghua people, Hokkien people, Cambodian Hokkien, Wangzhou, Jiangsu. Sa Taiwanese naman, Hokkien people, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. Teochew people, Hainese people. Ito naman, sa Cantonese, tatlo din, apat na uri is Guangsai people, Shupis people, Guanghunis, Weitu people. Hakkanese, Hopo people, Ngai, Taiwanese, Hakka, Samkyang people, Kiangsi, Jiangwei, Jiangze people, Shanghainese, and Wenzhouese. Mingwong. Other Han Chinese subgroups is ito yung Tanka, Peranakan, Benteng Chinese, Sino-Burmese, Chinese Mestizo, Hindian, sa Hui naman, Pantay, and Chinhao. Ito na. Sa Hongmian is Sa, Sandiu, Mien, Mong, Miao, Gamo people, Amao people, Paten people, and Jia people. Next is Kraday. Sa Kraday is ito yung Thai, Lao, Kaday, Kamsui people, Thai, Saek, Nung, Nyao, Lu, Kongsat, White Thai, and Shan people. Sa Indo-Aryan and Dravidian naman, ito ay sa Indo-Aryan, Rohingya people. Sa Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, Burmese Indians, Indians in Brunei, Indians Indonesian, Indian settlement in the Philippines, Indians in Thailand, Malaysian Indian, Singapore Indian, and Sri Lankans in Malayan. And next is Arabian. Arabian is Indonesian Arab, Arab Singaporean, Arab Malaysian, Arab Filipinos, and Hadrami people. Last is yung Eurasian, Amerasian, Filipino Mestizo or Zamboangueño people, Eurasians in Singapore, Kristang people, Indo people, and Anglo-Burmese. Yan po yung klase ng mga indigenous people sa Southeast Asia. And how do we distinguish ourselves from ethnic minorities? Ethnic minorities are people with certain common traits that set them apart from majority in a society. So, yan nga po yung sinabi kanina, yung Canada, ethnicity or religion. Minorities often suffer from discrimination and they struggle from the protection of their rights and their participation in the larger society. The United Nations Organization has responded accordingly and adopted the Minority Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities. Important to note that the Minority Declaration refers to the individual rights of members of minorities. They are referred to as persons and not as collective as people. What are our collective rights? The collective rights enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP, are not new rights but are inherent rights which are already contained in various other international instruments such as, among others, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So in some cases, napo-force sila na umalis sa mga lugar nila, kung saan sila lumaki, kung saan sila sinilang. So mga violent conflicts, and pinapalipat sila sa ibang lugar, ibang country, like Thailand, Vietnam, or Laos. In these countries, we are clearly not the first inhabitants. So ito na yon, yung right to self-determination. Sa Article 3 of the UNDRIP particularly state that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And the Article 4 elaborates that in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs. In Article 46, the Declaration, however, stresses that nothing in the Declaration may be interpreted as implying for anybody the right to engage in activities which threaten the territorial integrity or political unity of states. And yung mga rights po is itutuloy ni Maceda po. Thank you.
Next slide. Yan, sa right to land, territories, and resources naman tayo. Sinasabi dito sa Article 25 and 26 of Declaration, sinasabi dito na dapat ang indigenous people may karapatan sila sa mga lands, territories, and resources na meron sila. Sinasabi rin dito na shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources with due respect to custom and tradition of indigenous people to land tenure system. Next is right to free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. FPIC means that indigenous people have the right to accept or reject a project or any other form of intervention in their communities and territories, or that they define the condition for the project implementation based on their collective decision-making processes. Of particular importance is Article 10, which state that indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their land or territories. No relocation shall take place without free, prior, and informed consent and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possibly with the option of return. They see FPIC as an important standard indigenous people can use to claim their rights to self-determination, consultation, and participation in decision-making. Governments and corporations can no longer ignore this principle. FPIC is a standard protection by international human rights law. Cultural rights. This right is stipulated in Article 8 of the Declaration, which state that indigenous people and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture, and state shall provide effective mechanism to prevent and provide readiness to forced assimilation. Ito yung mga work, yung mga water, lahat ng meron sila. Next slide po, Ate Judy May. Sa right development naman, several articles in the Declaration refer to develop Articles 3, 20, 21, 23, 29, and 32. In sum, this article provides that indigenous people have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems and institutions, and to secure their own means of subsistence and development, including the freedom to engage in tradition and other economic activities. Those deprived of such means are entitled to just and fair redress. They have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for their own development, and to be actively involved in health, housing, and other economic and social programs, which to the extent possible they will administer through their own institution. Wait lang, may dadagdag lang ako. Yung mga nakalagay naman dito sa right to development, ito yung mga self-determination, popular participation in development, full sovereignty over natural resources, equality of opportunity, the creation of favorable conditions for the enjoyment of other civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. The human person is identified as the beneficiary of the right to develop. As of all human rights, the right to develop can invoke both by individuals and by people. It imposes obligation both on individual state to ensure equal and adequate access to essential resources and on the international community to promote fair development policies and effective international cooperation. Sinasabi naman dito sa how many indigenous people are there in Southeast Asia, meron na sinasabi na nakatira na mga indigenous people na 300 million population, meron sila. Few states in Southeast Asia, however, recognize indigenous people, and even if they do, our identity has not been taken into account during preparation of national censuses. It is therefore very difficult to give accurate or even approximate figures for the population of indigenous people in the Southeast Asia region. The map presents a compilation of some of the information available on the number of diversity of indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia. The figures provided have to be taken with the caution, however, they have been retrieved from various sources which are often diverging considerably and in many, if not most cases, are best based on informed estimate. Yun lang po. Next po si Warren Lim.
Hello. What are our common issues? We, the indigenous peoples of the ASEAN nation, have parallel histories of struggle for the recognition and the affirmation of our identity as distinct peoples with our own particular lifestyles, social, cultural, and political systems. In varying degrees, but certainly similar in experiences, is a thread of common issues that bind us in our continuing endeavor against marginalization and discrimination and for the recognition of our rights. Non-recognition as indigenous peoples already early on in the work on the draft of the UNDRIP, several Asian governments have expressed their reservation with regards to the application of the concept of indigenous peoples to their countries. And right after the declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly, this position was reiterated by representatives of Asian countries. In short, their position is the lack of definition prevents a clear understanding of who the declaration applies to, and that based on existing definition, like for example, that of the ILO, it can be concluded that their nation does not have any indigenous peoples, or that all its citizens are equally indigenous. Next. Violations to our right to our land, territories, and resources. The concept of land and territories has many dimensions that are vital to indigenous peoples. Collectively, a collective identity, the matter of historical connection and deep affinity to our land and territories which we have managed and controlled in our own sustainable ways is a reason for our persistence to hold on to these lands and Land is our source of life, the basis of our livelihood and our identity. The UNDRIP fully recognizes the importance of land, territories, and resources for indigenous peoples. This is further emphasized by the recognition of indigenous peoples' right to free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, as requirements to safeguard our right over our land, territories, and resources, and our right to self-determination. This includes our right to define our own approaches to and plans for development. Development aggression. Indigenous peoples often live in areas rich in natural resources, which have become targets of resources extraction and development programs by government and multinational companies. In the name of modernization and development of the nation, our communities are faced with the impact of mining and logging large-scale plantations and infrastructure programs. These projects are implemented without consultation and consent from the affected communities and causes massive displacement of indigenous communities and consequently to the loss of their livelihood. Culture and identity. The following provides a few examples of the form of imposed development on indigenous communities in the ASEAN region. Next po, Pamela Rodriguez.
In Cambodia, economic land concessions for commercial plantations such as rubber, cassava, corn for biofuel have been granted on indigenous communities' lands. According to Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, as of May 2010, ELC have been given to 85 companies covering a total land area of 956,690, has located in 16 provinces. There are many reported cases of forced eviction of indigenous communities as a result of the granting of ELC. The number of concessions for mining is also increasing. Expo. In Indonesia, over 7.5 million hectares of land are already covered by oil palm plantation. Many of these plantations have been established on forest land traditionally used by indigenous peoples. Reports published in recent years show that land acquisition and the establishment of oil palm plantation go along with serious abuses of the right of local communities, many of whom belong to indigenous peoples. Their land is often taken without their free, prior informed consent and without due payment. In Laos, a recent moratorium on land possessions has temporarily stopped the rapid expansion of plantation, mostly for rubber, which the country has experienced over the past few days. In mid-2009, it was estimated that there were already 180,000 million has of rubber plantations in Laos, up from a negligible amount just 5 years earlier. A temporary slowdown of the implementation of Lao government plan for hydroelectric dams have been brought about the recent global financial crisis. Dito po, kumbaga, nawawalan po ng right yung mga indigenous people kasi po, nakakuha na po ng government and dapat po na sila yung may hawak nung right na yun, pero hindi ho sila yung nakahawak nun dahil kinukuha sa kanila na walang consent. Ganun po. Next reporter, Miss Robles. Josephine po.
Malaysia has an estimated 4 million hectares of oil palm plantation. As in Indonesia, they have in most cases been imposed on indigenous communities without neither free prior informed consent and due compensation. Particularly worrying are the recently announced new mega dam project in Sarawak. The proposed massive dam are intended to generate cheap electricity for Malaysia's manufacturing industries, which are intended to be relocated to the state and for China's rapidly expanding economy. An investment of $11 billion has been pledged by the State Grid Corporation of China. The number of people who will face eviction is still unclear, but the scale of impact on indigenous community will certainly be immense. Dito daw po, minumungkahing napakalaking pangarap ng mga taga-Malaysia na nais na magkaroon ng murang kuryente para sa manufacturing ng industriya ng Malaysia at para sa mabilis na pagpapalawak ng ekonomiya ng China. Next slides po. Since 1990, the Philippine government has approved more than 300 mineral production sharing agreements and 4 financial and technical assistance agreements. The latter contracts allow foreigners to own mining operations. Between January and March 2010, the Mines and Geosciences Bureau, MGB, has already approved 20 new exploration permits covering a total area of 122,000 hectares nationwide. Mining applications cover already over 40% of the country's total land area. Much of this mineral-rich land is located in the ancestral domains of indigenous peoples, with up to 60% of ancestral domains impacted by mining applications and 39 of the 63 government priority mining projects directly overlapping ancestral domains. Next slides po. In the Mekong region, the implementation of the Greater Mekong Sub-Region GMS program involving 6 countries, Cambodia, China, especially Yunnan and Guangxi provinces, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam, has contributed to the rapid economic growth in most of these countries, but has negatively impacted indigenous community. Dito daw po, ang mga may hirap na taga-nayon, yung mga taga-Mekong po, ay tumataas ang kahirapan sa paglalaan ng pagkain para sa kanilang pamilya. Ang pinagkukunan po ng pagkain ay ang halos lahat po sa lokasyon po ng Mekong. Next reporter po.
Yes. The threats and violence against indigenous human rights defenders. Our struggle against development aggression and assertion, pakibalik po, of our collective rights has led to many violations of our civil and political rights. This includes threats, intimidation, harassment, arbitrary arrest, and extrajudicial killing of human rights defenders and our leaders. Next slide po. In Sarawak, Malaysia, 15 indigenous leaders who were submitting their petition letter to the government against the proposed construction of dams which will affect their communities were arrested for illegal assembly and detained for 8 hours last 2009. They were released but still have to appear in court to face their charges. Next slide. In the Philippines, indigenous leaders who were at the front line against mining and development aggression in the Cordillera became victims of extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearance. Next slide. Among the 70 reported cases of extrajudicial killings of indigenous leaders nationwide is that of Marcus Banggit, a well-known indigenous leader of the Cordillera People's Alliance, who was killed along with an innocent bystander in 2006 when he and his son were on their way to the city from the province. Next slide. James Balao, another prominent indigenous leader and human rights defender of the Cordillera region, was abducted by alleged state forces in 2008 and has never been seen again up to date. Yun lang.
Okay na.
Okay.
Okay na, nakapicture na ako. Isa pa ba? Sige, sige.
Thank you.
Isa pa.
Sige, isa pa. Kasi yung iba hindi naka-on cam kanina.